On December the 24th, 1913, a man entered a crowded party and shouted a single fateful word. Fire. That word set off a panic, which escalated into a disaster. By the end of the night, 73 people had lost their lives, most of them children. But who was this man, and why did he shout fire when there was no fire? This is the story of the Italian Hall disaster, a horrific, preventable tragedy. It unfolded on a bitterly cold night in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where a long and bitter mining strike had left the town yearning for some Christmas cheer. Tragically, that celebration ended with 59 child-sized coffins and more questions than answered. Yet, the events of that 1913 night go far beyond the loss of lives. The Italian Hall disaster brought together striking miners, hired thugs, the elusive American dream, a congressional investigation, and even a song from singer-songwriter Woody Guthrie. Despite its significance, this story is not nearly as well known as it should be. The native people of Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula long recognized that the area was abundant in a red shiny metal now known as copper. However, it wasn't until the 1840s that American businesses realized just how much copper lay beneath the surface and how profitable its extraction could be. Almost as if by fate, while newspapers were busy reporting on the discovery of one of the richest copper deposits in the United States, another mine was closing down. Cornwall, England, had been home to copper mines for generations, but by then the ore was finally running out. Facing the prospect of unemployment, workers decided to pack up and move to America. In 1875 alone, up to 10,000 miners left England, and many settled in northern Michigan. For foodies, this is why UP is known for Cornish pasties, by the way. Since the Cornish immigrants arrived first, they established the early mining system. As a result, the mines operated much like those in Cornwall, and the cousin jacks often secured the best jobs. Several companies tried setting up shop in Copper County, but the Calumet and Hecla Mining Company eventually emerged as the leader. This Boston-based corporation owned all the land surrounding the mines and invested in miners' well-being by providing housing, schools, transportation, and entertainment centers. At first glance, it's appeared to be a pretty good deal. However, when the mining company owns absolutely everything, well, it also has ultimate control, doesn't it? As the 19th century turned into the 20th, a wave of immigrants arrived in the United States from Eastern and Southern Europe. Michigan's copper towns became home to Finns, Swedes, Croatians, Italians, Poles, Austrians, and Germans. By 1900, Calumet's population was 90% immigrant. Yet despite the diversity of languages and cultures, the children of the original Cornish immigrants remained in charge. In essence, there were three main jobs in a mine. Surface workers stayed above ground to handle administrative tasks. Below ground, miners used drills to extract copper by blasting away unwanted rock. Then there were trammers, who hauled the discarded rock to the surface for disposal. The jobs were largely segregated based on ethnicity. Manager and surface jobs were reserved for English, Scandinavian, and German immigrants, while trammers, who worked long hours at the most exhausting and backbreaking job in the mine, received the lowest pay. Everyone knew that trammers were mostly Italian, Finnish, and Croatian. Mine work is extremely dangerous. It often involves traveling hundreds or even thousands of feet below ground with nothing more than a few candles for light. Once at the worksite, miners had to drill out the copper laboriously, inch by inch. As can be expected in professions that involve flying rock, accidents were real common. In an average week, 10 miners were injured and 1 died. Many recent immigrants had not fully realized what they were signing up for, and they found the experience truly terrifying. Despite the dangers, the Calumet and Hecla Mining Company continued operations uninterrupted for years. Gradually, however, the situation began to shift. In 1874, the company extracted 97 pounds of sellable copper for every ton of rock they mined. By 1900, that figure had dropped to only 53 pounds. Although the copper deposits in the peninsula were rich, they were not inexhaustible. To worsen this situation, open-pit mines had recently opened in the American Southwest, quickly taking over the market. To remain competitive, the mining companies decided to maximize the efficiency of every worker, a strategy that would ultimately turn the entire copper country upside down. In 1911, a new water-based drill made a splash on the mining scene. Whereas the older models required 2 or 3 men to operate, this new model only needed 1. To the mining companies, it signified peak efficiency. To the miners, however, they interpreted this as a sign that 50% of their co-workers were about to be laid off. Yet their opposition to the one-man drill went deeper than just fear of unemployment. In copper country, life revolved around family both above and below ground. The second person operating a drill was not simply a randomly paired co-worker, it was likely a close family member, someone they deeply cared about and had a personal stake in keeping employed. There was also serious safety concern with the one-man drill. Having a second person in the mine not only helped ease anxieties, but also ensured that someone was available to call for help in an emergency. The impending end of this buddy system was so alarming that the miners soon nicknamed the one-man drill the Widowmaker. Previously, trammers worked exclusively with trammers and miners worked with miners. In fact, many miners felt they shared more in common with management than the trammers. However, when the company announced that it would proceed with the one-man drill despite their protests, the miners came to the stark realization that management wasn't on their side. It was at this moment that a new player stepped into the scene, the Western Federation of Miners, also known as WFM. Their plan was simple but ambitious: unite all workers under one banner, a union. The man sent to Calumet to make this vision a reality was Charles H. Moyer, the president of the Western Federation of Miners. Moyer was a fascinating figure with a very colourful past. Born in the Midwest at the end of the American Civil War to a poor family, a teenage Moyer decided to quit school and head west. He eventually fell into the role of a stereotype, working as a cowboy and even serving a year in prison for robbery. However, after landing a job at a mine in South Dakota's Black Hills, Moyer discovered his talent for labor organizing. Elected president of the Western Federation of Miners in 1902, he quickly made a name for himself during the period that would later be known as the Colorado Labor Wars. In 1903, a group of WFM miners went on strike in Colorado Springs. Governor James Peabody, a staunch anti-union advocate, declared the strike an insurrection and imposed martial law. The Colorado militia was called in to arrest the striking miners en masse and to deport as many as possible. Moyer was caught up in these mass arrests. He demanded a writ of habeas corpus, a legal means to challenge the state's justification for his imprisonment. His request eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled in Moyer and Peabody that governors do not need probable cause to arrest people during an insurrection. The military ultimately succeeded in breaking the Colorado strike, and the experience transformed Moyer into an unapologetic socialist. In 1906, Moyer was arrested for the murder of the former governor of Idaho, although the evidence against him was incredibly flimsy. A former bodyguard of Moyer, suspected of building a bomb, had named various WFA members as co-conspirators. Despite having a fairly solid alibi, he was in Colorado, Moyer's name still appeared in national newspapers. Eventually, a jury found the bodyguard innocent and the charges against Moyer were dropped. Nonetheless, the incident cemented his reputation as a certified rabble-rouser. So, when the copper bosses in Michigan's Upper Peninsula heard that Moyer was unpacking a suitcase at the exact moment their workers were growing antsy, they were far from pleased. They insisted that he be whisked out of town on the next train. But, socialist or not, Moyer was good at his job. The Western Federation of Miners recruited a multilingual staff so they could communicate with the many different immigrants. They informed these workers that the new open-air pit mines paid an average of $4 a day compared to $2.50 that the workers in Keweenaw received. They also shared stories of their victories in winning an 8-hour workday, an appealing prospect for employees who usually worked 10.5-hour shifts. And of course, they promised to bring back the two-man drill. By spring 1913, the Western Federation of Miners had handed out 9,000 union membership cards, and they were ready to state their demands. In a letter to management, the union asked to be acknowledged as the official collective bargaining unit for the workers and laid out their planned improvements. The Calumet and Heckler Mining Company remained silent. They believed that even acknowledging the receipt of the letter would be taken by the union as official recognition. To avoid this, they pretended not to know what was happening. Fearing that they had no other option, the WFM decided to call a strike. In some parts of the world, labor strikes, they're just an everyday occurrence. However, in the United States back in 1913, they were a matter of life and death. From the moment the first railroad barons began consolidating their power, they planned to control their labor force by any means necessary. Both the mining company and its employees were well aware of the brutal history that could unfold, understanding that the situation held the potential for disaster, yet neither could have predicted just how dire the outcome would become. On June the 23rd, as many as 10,000 miners put down their tools, and for a day, no one in copper country was mining copper. June can be a dreary month in northern Michigan, and the 23rd was no exception. Clouds blanketed the sky while raindrops speckled the ground. Despite the cooler temperatures, long-simmering ethnic tensions finally erupted. Scattered fights broke out in Calumet, though only 3 injuries were recorded, all involving supervisors of Cornish descent who reported that they'd been hit by a rock. These playground antics were all the company needed to bring out the big guns. They convinced the Michigan governor that their town was overrun by an angry mob and that the National Guard was needed to restore order. The entire force of 2,500 men was sent to copper country. However, the Calumet and Heckler Mining Company, they wanted more than just soldiers to defend the peace and protect their property. They needed someone who could break the strike and get their workers back in the mines. they needed a detective agency. Although these detective agencies are often remembered romantically, their work extended far beyond solving crimes and smoking pipes. In addition to conducting private investigations, these agencies also provided private security. They had the power to carry guns, make arrests, and even beat miners into submission. If a company wanted to break a strike, a detective agency was their first stop. The Calumet and Heckler Mining Company might not have acknowledged the union, but they had already paid for the services of Waddell Mann Corporation 2 weeks before the strike even began. And even better, they got to use taxpayer money to fund it. It just so happened that the head of the mining company was also the head of the County Board of Supervisors. He decided that hiring strikebreakers was in the public's best interests, because of course he did. I'm sure the fact that it was his own best interest as well was just a big coincidence, right? Alright, so the detectives tried to blend in, but the townspeople spotted them anyway. Quoting them, "They are tall, muscular men of the prize-fighter variety." That was from a union newspaper. For good measure, the mining company also hired men from the Burns Detective Agency, the Asher Detective Agency, and the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Some of these men were officially deputized by the Houghton County Sheriff's Office, which granted them police powers over the striking miners. A showdown was about to begin. Strikes have a tendency to get a bit boring. Essentially, they involve protesting working conditions by refusing to work, and not working isn't exactly the kind of action that energizes crowds or attracts media attention. So, unions needed something for people to do that isn't work, a distraction, something eye-catching, and ideally an act that shames those who aren't participating. Hence, the picket line. Workers band together, often chanting, singing, or holding signs outside the business they are protesting. This not only draws public attention, but also forces those still working to pass by their striking co-workers as they clock in. The miners of Calumet, however, took this idea a bit further. Instead of forming a picket line, they organized a picket parade. In the town where the Calumet and Heckler Mining Company essentially owned everything, there wasn't a single location for protest. And I mean, really, who doesn't love a parade? As with everything in copper country, striking was a family affair. Women joined their fathers, husbands, and sons in the strike parade, not only to show their solidarity, but also to protect their male relatives. If the National Guard, the sheriff's deputies, or the Waddell Mann detectives sought to arrest the men for participating in the strike, they would first have to contend with their wives, mothers, and daughters. At the head of the roughly 2,000 participants was Annie Clements. The eldest daughter of a family of Slovenian immigrants, Annie had recently married a Croatian miner named Joe. Known as Big Annie because she stood at 6 feet 2 inches, she donned a simple gingham dress and carried a large American flag on a 10-foot pole. Her image at the front of the parade, flag in hand, became an enduring icon of the copper strike. And as the days turned into weeks, the strike parade faced increasing pushback from law enforcement. Annie refused to be intimidated. She confronted the police and National Guard head-on and even allowed herself to be arrested. At one point, a soldier asked her why she didn't stay home like a normal wife, and Annie replied, "My work is here, and nobody can stop me. I'm going to keep at it until this strike is won." The Calumet and Heckler Mining Company hadn't been too worried when the strike broke out. They had plenty of copper ready to sell and enough cash to tide them over. However, as the strike persisted and the mines remained at a standstill, they faced mounting pressure to restart production. The idea of negotiating with the union to bring their workers back hadn't even crossed their minds. Instead, agents were dispatched to eastern port cities to recruit immigrants straight off the boat. These new workers, who likely had never heard of Calumet and knew nothing about the strike, were loaded onto one-way trains and sent directly to the mines. The cost of their journey was deducted from their future wages, leaving them in debt from the moment they arrived. And if they wanted to leave, well, that wasn't an option. When not working in the mines, they were confined to bunkhouses guarded by armed sentries, a measure the mining company insisted was necessary to protect them from the striking miners. Things were beginning to take a turn for the worse, and they would only continue to deteriorate. On Thursday, August the 14th, Ivan Kalin and Ivan Stimac, both of Croatian descent, joined a group of fellow strikers to visit a WFM outpost. They'd heard that strike benefits would be available during their period of unemployment, yet none had been provided. It would soon emerge that the WFM had grossly overestimated their resources and was unable to offer any relief to the striking workers. They would have to make do with whatever little they had. After learning they wouldn't be getting any money, the group turned to head home. Along the way, Callan and Stimac decided to hang back and buy soda pops from a local store. By the time they finished their drinks, they were eager to get back to Seaberville, a nearby town where they rented rooms in boarding houses. They took a familiar shortcut, a decision that would prove to be a horrible mistake. The two men were almost home when a man ran up to them, waving a billy club and shouting in English. He explained that they were on mine property and that, as strikers, this counted as trespassing. The two Croatians spoke very little English and had only the vaguest idea of what he was saying. The man with the club ordered them to turn around, but the strikers ignored him and continued walking. It turned out that the man who stopped them reported the incident to his boss. His boss quickly realized that the problem was simply a communication issue, but by then it no longer mattered. The Watermahon detectives were already on the case, which meant that justice was not going to be served. 6 strikebreakers arrived at the boarding house to discover dangerous criminals playing lawn bowling in the side yard. They hopped the fence, and a fistfight soon erupted between the residents and the strikebreakers. In response, the landlord's brother, Stephen Putrick, stepped outside to see what was happening. Amid the chaos, a strikebreaker fired his gun, striking Putrick in his stomach. He died shortly afterward. Following this initial shot, the strikebreakers continued firing randomly into the boarding house. Multiple people were injured, and one of the tenants, Alois Tien, was killed. Although Callan and Stimac were eventually arrested, the force used was so egregious that no one could ignore it. Ultimately, all 6 strikebreakers were charged with murder. The striking miners were outraged by the incident. The funeral procession for the victims turned into a massive event, with Big Annie leading a procession of 5,000 mourners, a striking display of solidarity. But things were not going to improve. On Labor Day, ironically enough, a 14-year-old girl was shot in the head during the strike parade. She did survive, though. On another occasion, the National Guard attempted to block the strikers from occupying a public street. When Big Annie pressed on regardless, a mounted guardsman drew his saber, knocking the American flag from her hands. In the process, the fabric was torn and her finger cut. The flag fell into the mud and was trampled by the horse's hooves. Annie quickly snatched up the fallen flag and pressed it to her chest. Although the soldiers tried to take it from her, she refused to let go. She declared, "Run your bayonets and sabers through this flag and kill me, but I won't move. If this flag will not protect me, then I will die with it." In the end, the soldiers had no choice but to retreat. Big Annie had won the day. The fall slowly turned into winter, and the mining company still refused to budge. Things were growing desperate for the miners, who hadn't seen a paycheck since summer. Meanwhile, Calumet and Heckler Mining Company was serving eviction notices, and local grocery stores no longer accepted credit. With the situation becoming so dire, many of the strikers began searching for alternative employment. Henry Ford's factory in Detroit offered a starting salary of $5 a day, more than what they would earn if the strike succeeded. Before long, the trickle of people leaving Calumet became a flood. It seemed that the situation in copper country had reached a deadlock. Little did they know, however, that the struggle was far from over. The mining company still had one more card to play, one with the potential to bring everything crashing down. It was called the Citizens Alliance. In theory, it was a grassroots organization opposed to unions, socialism, and the disorder that comes from strikes. In reality, it was a pressure group created and paid for by the Calumet and Heckler Mining Company. Their primary activity was holding rallies that featured live music, speeches, and an open bar. To gain entry, attendees had to become official members of the Citizens Alliance. This membership involved 2 requirements: sign a paper declaring that the Western Federation of Miners had to go, and wear a white button bearing the group's name. The rallies were an immediate hit. In December alone, over 8,000 people joined. However, the number of those who attended solely for the free booze will forever remain a mystery. While the Citizens Alliance claimed to stand for law and order, the complimentary alcohol did not help their image. It was not uncommon for intoxicated men to leave a rally fired up and eager to cause chaos. This energy was often redirected toward vandalizing union halls or other buildings associated with the strike, and if the strikers had dared to call the police about the property damage, they might well have attracted even more Watermahon detectives. The WFM realized in December that they were no closer to negotiating a deal than they had been back in June. In fact, the mines were gradually returning to production with the help of hurriedly shipped-in immigrants. It was slowly becoming clear to everyone that the strike might actually fail, rendering all the suffering that they had endured completely in vain. On December the 7th, shots rang out at a boarding house in nearby Painsdale, a known residence for Cornish mining bosses. Unlike every other ethnic group, the Cousin Jacks had refused to join the union and continued working in the mines. In an act reminiscent of the earlier incident at the Croatian boarding house, 2 men, the Hooter brothers, fired randomly into the establishment. As a tragic consequence, 3 Cornish immigrants lost their lives: the Jane brothers, who had recently arrived from Canada, and the landlord, Thomas Daly. Their deaths transformed the Citizens Alliance's warnings of chaos and disorder from claims into an indisputable reality. Anger quickly swept through the community, and not even the arrest of the Hooter brothers could calm the storm. Copper Country had been on a collision course with disaster for months by this point, but as the calendar turned toward Christmas, that train was now just impossible to reverse. Like the road to hell, the path to the Italian Hall disaster had been laid with good intentions. Big Annie had recently taken over the Women's Auxiliary of the Western Federation of Miners, and she knew all too well that the financial situation in Calumet meant a grim Christmas for many. Though she couldn't remove all their troubles, she and the other women were determined to ensure that the children of the striking miners enjoyed a happy Christmas. The Women's Auxiliary decided to host a Christmas Eve party. It wouldn't be fancy, but there would be a Christmas tree, caroling, a Mother Goose play, and even a chance to meet Santa Claus. Every child was to receive a small present, a pair of mittens, a scarf, a small bag of candy, or a piece of fruit. The venue they chose was the Italian Hall, which was owned and operated by the Società Mutua Beneficenza Italiana. This aid organization supported recent Italian immigrants, but it also maintained a large building with an event space available for rent. In America today, this would be similar to booking a room at VFW or a Knights of Columbus building. The Italian Hall was a two-story building. On the bottom level, there was a store on one side and a saloon on the other. The second level housed the event space, which featured a large room with a stage at one end, folding chairs, and a small kitchen. Guests entered through the main entrance and almost immediately ascended a tall, steep staircase located directly in front of the door. This floor plan posed no issues until after the disaster. The party officially began at 2, but guests started arriving around noon. By 4 o'clock, the event was in full swing. As many as 700 people were crammed into the event hall, and children outnumbered adults 10-1. The roar of the holiday music, combined with the excited chatter of young voices, was nearly deafening. One person in attendance was Mary Cascala. Although she was not a member of the WFA and felt neutral about the strike, her daughter wanted to attend the party. As a result, her brother-in-law asked if she could bring his 3 children along as well. Mary agreed, and her brother-in-law handed her his union card. She presented the card at the entrance of the Italian Hall, and both she and the children were allowed inside. Mrs. Cascala stood with her neighbors at the front of the stage when someone entered the room. She later described the newcomer as a broad fellow with a dark mustache, wearing a cap and a high collar as well as an overcoat. She noted the unmistakable white circle button pin on him, although she was too far away to read any text on it. Then, the man shouted, "Fire!" He delivered the word in English, even though nearly everyone in the room was an immigrant. Those who were multilingual quickly translated the message, and soon the hall was filled with shouting in Finnish, Croatian, Italian, and more. Then the man shouted again, "Fire!" According to Mrs. Cascala, he raised his arms as if inviting everyone to turn toward him, toward the door. Then he vanished behind the surge of people. Big Annie and the other auxiliary women tried to calm the crowd. There was no smell of smoke and no indication that evacuation was necessary. Even if there had been a reason to panic, it would only have made things worse. They needed everyone to stop screaming and regain control. But it was hopeless. Everyone was screaming and the situation was already spiraling out of control. As the mass moved toward the exit, children were helplessly swept along in the motion, the crowd funneling through the door into the narrow hall leading to the stairs. A wall blocked their view of the exit, so no one knew what was happening until it was too late. It started with a simple trip on the stairs. Normally, not an issue. But this staircase was so packed that others lost their balance as well. A crowd of people, most of them children, tumbled to the bottom. Those behind them were unable to stop or turn because of the force of people coming from behind, which was just too great. They fell on top of the initial group of children, crushing them under their body weight. Even more people piled in, adding to the mass. The door had completely disappeared under the heap of humanity, trapping everyone who was still inside the hall. A few people who had managed to escape before the crisis quickly ran to a far call box. Within minutes, sirens were racing toward the Italian Hall. They were only a block away, but by then it was already too late. Approximately 100 people were entangled on the staircase, some still alive, others already dead. The firemen threw open the door, but the bodies were piled too high, and the weight of those on top was overwhelming. They had to get inside the building and rescue the people one by one from the top of the stairs. So they made their way up a fire escape that those in the hall had been too panicked to remember existed. Then they began the arduous and heartbreaking task of pulling the victims out of the pile. When everyone had been accounted for, 73 bodies were laid out in a makeshift morgue. 59 were children. 50 of the dead were Finnish, 13 Croatian, 7 Slovenian, and 3 Italian. No one had been prepared for such a disaster, especially not one so close to Christmas. A call went out to nearby towns for child-sized coffins. It was a grim Christmas in copper country that year. Families woke the next morning to find themselves incomplete, their loss as sharp and unrelenting as a pulled tooth. The Women's Auxiliary of the Citizens Alliance went from house to house, offering money to those who had lost family members, only to be unilaterally turned down. The union, the family said, would bury its own dead. 3 days later, a mass funeral was held on December the 28th. 4 churches of different faiths conducted simultaneous services before a procession was made to the local Lakeview Cemetery. The miners had dug 3 large trench graves for the victims to be lowered into. Photographs of the heartbreaking ceremony were published in newspapers nationwide. With their children laid to rest, the town of Calumet began to wonder, was this a terrible accident, or was this murder? Charles Moyer was convinced that he had the answer. As president of the WFM, he had been briefed on the events at Italian Hall. Although he wasn't entirely sure if the reports about the Citizens Alliance button on the man's jacket were credible, one fact did remain clear. The Italian Hall disaster required a thorough investigation, and he was the person who was going to ensure that it happened. Moyer spent Christmas Eve at the Hotel Scott in the nearby town of Hancock, writing telegrams to anyone who might listen. His list included the governor of Michigan, several senators, a congressman, the president, and anyone else with any authority. He did not accuse anyone of a crime, nor claim that one had been committed. He simply wanted an external party to look into the incident. A knock at his hotel room door then startled him. Moyer was not expecting any visitors, while others might have assumed it was a group of Christmas carolers. Well, Moyer knew better. It was the county sheriff, surrounded by local dignitaries. They had heard about his telegrams and wanted him to stop drawing attention to the Italian Hall disaster. They also demanded that he state outright that the Citizens Alliance had nothing to do with the terrible accident. Predictably, Moyer refused. At that point, the sheriff warned that he would no longer be able to protect him. In silence, the group left the hotel room. Moyer wasted no time getting back to work. He immediately picked up the phone to make another call. Charles H. Danner, the auditor for the WFM, was standing by the door when a mob spilled into the room, white Citizens Alliance pins gleaming on their coats. It had only been minutes since the sheriff left. Moyer turned around and saw that Tanner was being held at gunpoint. Then, 2 men seized him from behind. There was a violent struggle as Moyer tried to break free. Someone smacked him across the back of the head with a pistol, accidentally causing it to fire. A bullet lodged in his back, enough to cause pain, but not enough to kill. Woozy and subdued, the group dragged Moyer and Tanner out of the hotel and into the cold December street. Moyer recalled shouts of "shoot him" and "lynch him." When they crossed the Horton-Hancock Bridge, the mob shoved Moyer against the railing, threatening to throw him over the edge and into the freezing water. Kicking and cursing the entire way, they dragged him to the train station. They explained that if the 2 men ever returned to Calumet, they would be killed. With one final shove, Moyer and Tanner were forced onto a train bound for Chicago. Oddly enough, having been shot and dangled over a bridge by the Citizens Alliance did not convince Moyer of their innocence. Shortly after the train reached Chicago, Moyer held a press conference from a hospital bed, vowing to return to Copper Country as soon as he could. Meanwhile, in Calumet, a coroner's inquest was underway. Unlike previous investigations, witnesses were not offered interpreters. All questions were asked in English, and responses were required to be in English as well. This limitation severely restricted the available testimony, given that nearly everyone at the Italian Hall was a non-English speaker. Even if it wasn't intentional, the inquest certainly appeared to have something to hide. Ultimately, the coroner refused to establish a cause of death for the victims of the Italian Hall disaster. The question of whether this tragedy stemmed from an accident or was a homicide continued to haunt Copper Country. In early 1914, Charles Moyer saw his wish come true. A subcommittee from the United States House of Representatives was dispatched to the Keweenaw Peninsula to gather a complete testimony of the events surrounding the Italian Hall disaster, with interpreters included. Of the 70 witnesses who testified, 18 said that they heard someone shout, "Fire." Of those, 9 claimed they actually saw the man who sounded the alarm, and 6 of these 9 testified that he was wearing a white button believed to be the insignia of the Citizens Alliance. This detail served as substantial proof, but unfortunately it didn't lead anywhere. The newly created US Department of Labor produced a detailed report on the strike that remains available today. However, they found no evidence that a crime had been committed, and once again the case was dropped. The spring of 1914 offered little comfort to the miners. In addition to facing stalled investigations, they were still on strike. Yet the loss of the children seemed to shatter the small remnants of resolve the people had left. Unwilling to live with the ghosts of the Italian Hall disaster, hundreds of people moved south to Detroit. One of those who was left was Big Annie. By the time of the disaster, her marriage was already falling apart. After her divorce, she began a romance with a reporter named Fran Shavs, who had come to Calumet to cover the strike for a Slovenian-language newspaper in Chicago. Annie eventually left Copper Country to join him in the big city, where they married and later had a daughter named Darwina. Those who remained no longer had the strength to fight. When Charles Moyer returned to Calumet, fulfilling his promise, he found the situation hopeless. On April 13, 1914, the Western Federation of Miners called an end to the strike. In doing so, the Calumet and Hector Mining Company had won. About half of the former workforce eventually returned to work, but only on the condition that they surrendered their union cards. They were also required to sign a letter addressed to the mine's general manager, thanking him for breaking the strike and saving them from the villainous Western Federation of Miners. In addition, they had to contribute 5 cents for the purchase of a nice watch for him. And with that, life in the copper country returned to something resembling normal. Yet the good old days were long behind them. There was still less copper in the ground than there was 50 years ago, and no amount of strike breaking could change that. The mine limped along through the Great Depression and World War II, expanding into other minerals just to stay afloat. The town fell into disrepair as workers left, and soon the great copper mines of the early 20th century just became a memory. The Italian Hall disaster, for all its horror, was just largely forgotten. To this day, no one knows who shouted fire. Without knowing his identity, it is impossible to guess at his motives. Could it have been an honest mistake? Well, maybe. Fires were common in the beginning of the 20th century, which is precisely why the crowd panicked in the first place. It was a reasonable thing to fear. But if the eyewitnesses are correct, and he was wearing a Citizens Alliance pin, then the motive takes on a more sinister tone, doesn't it? Perhaps he was one of those fired-up individuals who smashed union halls and thought it was amusing to incite panic. Or maybe the Citizens Alliance itself wanted to ruin the Christmas party and knew a call of fire would force its cancellation. Yet, could the man really have predicted that all those children would have been crushed to death on the staircase? That's just impossible to know. Over the years, rumors have circulated about the Italian Hall disaster. Some speculated that the man couldn't have been a Citizens Alliance member because union cards were checked at the entrance to the party. This argument's easily debunked, though. Although cards had been diligently checked at the start of the party, by the time of the disaster, the auxiliary had long since abandoned the practice. Multiple patrons of the downstairs saloon reported that they had wandered in without anyone noticing. Another rumor asserted that the doors of the hall opened inward, a design that would today be a major fire code violation. Outward opening exit doors are required so that disasters like the Italian Hall disaster can be prevented, ensuring that people are not crushed while leaving a building. This rumor was so persistent that it was even included on the site's historical marker before being removed. However, eyewitness accounts and building blueprints confirmed that the doors did open outward. In fact, this tragedy occurred not because of the doors, but despite them. This misconception may have paved the way for an even more vicious rumor. Over time, the story evolved from one where a lone Citizens Alliance member inadvertently caused panic into a full-blown conspiracy theory involving the deliberate murder of minors' children. In this version, the man was allegedly sent to shout fire while his accomplices stationed themselves at the exits, deliberately holding the doors closed. If true, this act would undisputably count as murder. But there's no evidence to suggest that this happened. Multiple people managed to exit before the disaster occurred, including one who even called the fire department. Even if someone intentionally sparked the initial panic, the ensuing deaths were ultimately an unfortunate accident caused by someone tripping on the stairs. In the end, the Italian Hall disaster was a tragedy, and if the Citizens Alliance was responsible for shouting fire, they were effective at covering their tracks. Both the inquest and the congressional investigation uncovered nothing conclusive. No one was willing to reveal who had shouted fire. Perhaps it was this unsatisfactory resolution that allowed the Italian Hall disaster to fade from public consciousness. However, in 1945, the event experienced a resurgence. American singer-songwriter Woody Guthrie was an unapologetic socialist and a major voice in folk music. His most famous song, This Is Your Land, was written as a populist response to God Bless America. He frequently performed with This Machine Kills Fascists emblazoned across his guitar. When he heard about the Italian Hall disaster, he was inspired to create a song in its memory. There are factual inaccuracies in his song, including the fact that the strikebreakers did not hold the door shut. Yet, it also references real events such as Big Annie trying to calm the crowd. The song was never one of his most popular, but it remains the best-known interpretation of the tragedy. And Woody Guthrie was undeniably right about one thing. The Italian Hall disaster is a story about greed. On one side was the Calumet and Heckler Mining Company, greedy for profits and shareholder dividends. On the other side were the miners, greedy for higher wages and an 8-hour workday. Many have argued that one side was more just than the other, but ultimately it doesn't matter. The conflict led to the deaths of 73 people. The images of the children laid out in the makeshift morgue and the tiny coffins prepared for burial, they're going to remain with us forever. They are the ones who really paid the price. And so to quote Woody Guthrie's song, 1913 Massacre, quote, "The parents, they cried, and the miners, they moaned. See what your greed for money has done." Thank you for watching.